She crossed half a continent on the strength of a letter he never wrote. He hadn't spoken more than a dozen words to another human being in 3 years. And the moment she collapsed into his arms on that frozen mountain road, everything either of them thought they knew about survival was about to be proven wrong. This is the story of two broken people, one brutal winter, and a lie that somehow became the truest thing either of them ever lived. Stay until the end, because the ending will wreck you in the best possible way. Drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. The stagecoach shouldn't have been on that road. Any driver with half a brain and a lick of sense knew that the trail winding up through the Briar Pass had no business being traveled after the first week of October. The locals called it the Widow's Climb, not for the view, not for the history, but because the road was exactly that narrow, exactly that steep, and the mountain was exactly that indifferent to human error. Men had gone over the edge up there in dry summer weather. In November, with black ice hiding under a fresh skin of snow and the wind coming off the northern peaks like something personal, the road wasn't a road at all. It was a dare, and yet there it was. Ethan Crow heard it before he saw it. The labored groan of wheels fighting frozen ruts, the desperate percussion of hooves struggling for purchase on icy ground, the hollow crack of a whip that wasn't doing any good. He was splitting wood behind the barn when the sound reached him, and he straightened slowly, axe still in hand, and listened with the particular attention of a man who had learned to read the mountain the way other people read books. Something was wrong. He set the axe against the barn wall without hurrying, because hurrying on ice had killed more people than recklessness ever had, and he walked around to the front of the property, where the trail curved down through a break in the pine trees before it reached his gate. What he saw made something cold move through his chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. The coach was listing badly to the left. One of the rear wheels had caught in a frozen rut carved deep by the last thaw and refreeze cycle, and the driver, a young man, no older than 20, face white as the snow around him, was standing on the footboard and leaning his entire weight away from the drop-off side, as though his body weight could somehow correct a 400-pound wooden vehicle tipping toward a 30-foot ravine. It couldn't. Ethan was already moving. He hit the gate latch without breaking stride, crossed the open ground between the fence and the road in a flat run that his knees would remind him about for the next 2 days, and got to the lead horses just as the left rear wheel broke completely free of the rut and the whole coach lurched another few degrees toward catastrophe. "Hold them," he said. He wasn't talking to the driver. He was talking to himself. He grabbed the near-side lead horse by the bridle with both hands, planted his boots into the frozen ground, and pulled. Not the animal. He wasn't trying to drag a horse anywhere. He was just making himself an anchor point, something solid for the animal to push against, giving it permission to lean into the resistance instead of shying away from it. Horses didn't panic when they had something to brace on. They panicked in the absence of direction. The horse settled, marginally. Enough. "Get something under that wheel," Ethan said, loud enough for the driver this time. "Anything. Branch, rock, whatever's within arm's reach. Do it now." The young driver scrambled off the footboard and half slid, half stumbled to the roadside, yanking a broken branch from the snowbank and jamming it under the sunken wheel with the frantic energy of someone who had very recently understood how close to dead he was. It took 7 minutes to get the coach level. Ethan knew because he counted. Counting was something he did when he needed to keep his hands busy and his mind from going somewhere he didn't want it to go. It was a habit he'd developed in the years since Margaret died, when the silence of the ranch had started to feel less like solitude and more like something alive that was slowly filling up the space inside his chest. When the coach was stable and the horses had stopped shaking and the driver had sat down in the snow and put his head between his knees, Ethan finally looked at the coach door. It was closed. He hadn't thought about passengers. The coach was a freight run. That's what the livery in Harwick used this route for, since no sensible passenger would book passage up the Widow's Climb in November. He'd assumed he was dealing with cargo, crates, maybe a strongbox. He walked to the door and opened it. The smell hit him first, the stale warmth of a small enclosed space that had been occupied for too long, the sharp edge of cold seeping through the gaps in the wood, and underneath both of those, something faint and unidentifiable, like dried flowers or old letters. Then he saw her. She was folded into the corner of the rear bench in the way that people arrange themselves when there's no one watching and comfort is the only consideration. Knees drawn up, coat pulled tight, one gloved hand pressed flat against the wall of the coach, as though she'd braced herself there at some point and simply forgotten to let go. Her hair was red, not the polite auburn that some women called red, genuinely, aggressively red, the color of embers when a fire is almost out, and it had come loose from whatever arrangement it had started the day in and was spilling across the collar of her coat in tangled waves. She was asleep, or she looked like she was asleep. Her eyes opened when the cold air came in. They were darker than he'd expected, green, but the kind of green that had a lot of gray in it, like pine trees in the rain. And they were sharp. That was the first thing he noticed, before the hollows under her cheekbones, or the way her lips were dry and cracked from the cold. Whatever else this woman was, she wasn't foggy. She came awake looking at him with the direct, measuring attention of someone who had learned not to trust first impressions, but was going to gather the data anyway. "Is it over?" she said. Her voice was lower than he expected. Steady. No hysteria, no tears, no performance of relief. Just a question. "The road problem," he said. "Yeah." She nodded, as though this was a perfectly sufficient answer, and began the process of unfolding herself from the bench. It was immediately apparent that something was wrong. Her movements were too careful, too deliberate. Her hand on the edge of the seat grip too tight, the placement of her feet too methodical for someone who was simply stiff from sitting. "When did you last eat?" he said. She stopped, looked at him. Something shifted in her expression. Not offense, exactly. More like the particular wariness of someone who had been reading other people's questions for hidden motives for long enough that the habit was automatic. "Yesterday," she said. "Morning." He did a rough calculation. It was past 3 in the afternoon. She'd been in a freezing coach without food for over 30 hours, on a road that had nearly put her at the bottom of a ravine. He stepped back and offered his hand. She looked at it for a moment, then she took it. The moment she stepped down from the coach, her legs gave. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would make a good story. No graceful collapse, no movie swoon. Her knees just stopped working, the way overworked muscles do when they've been held tight against cold and tension and fear for too long, and the sudden warmth of movement unravels them all at once. She went sideways, catching herself on his arm, her fingers closing around his forearm with a grip that was significantly stronger than he'd have expected from someone in her condition. He caught her. It was instinct. His arm went around her shoulders before he'd made any decision about it, and she was lighter than she should have been, which bothered him in a way he didn't examine. Her face was close to his for a moment, the moment it took for her to find her balance again. He could see that her skin was pale with cold, and something else, something underneath the cold, and her eyes were doing that thing again, that measuring, where she was cataloging him the same way he was cataloging her. "I'm fine," she said, and her voice was still steady, which he respected against his will. "Sure," he said. "I am." I didn't argue. She found her feet, let go of his arm, straightened her coat with the precise, practiced movements of someone maintaining dignity, because dignity was one of the few things still in her possession. That was when she said it. She looked at him. Not at the house, not at the land, not at the mountains behind him. At him, specifically, with those gray-green eyes that had already decided to be honest about something she hadn't planned to say out loud yet. "I'm your bride," she said. The wind moved through the pines. Somewhere up the slope, a branch dropped its load of snow with a soft collapse. Ethan Crow stood on the frozen road in front of his ranch and looked at this woman he had never seen before in his life and said nothing for long enough that the driver, still sitting in the snow with his head in his hands, looked up to check if someone had died. "No," Ethan said finally. "You're not." Her name was Violet Hale, and she had the marriage letter to prove it. She produced it from somewhere inside her coat, carefully folded, handled so many times that the creases were soft, and the paper had taken on a slightly different texture at the fold lines. She held it out to him without offering an explanation, which told him she'd already been in situations where explanations came after evidence. He took it, read it. It was his name, his address. A detailed description of the ranch that was accurate enough to be uncomfortable. The number of cattle, the location of the spring, the view of the northern peaks from the front window. Whoever had written this knew this land. The handwriting wasn't his. He'd have known his own handwriting in a blizzard at midnight. He'd been writing in the same cramped, slightly left-leaning hand since he was 8 years old, and his father had corrected him out of a natural right-handed slant. The letter in his hand was written in a neat, rounded script that was nothing like his. He read it twice, folded it back along its existing creases, handed it back. "I didn't write that," he said. She took the letter, looked at it, and he watched something move across her face, not surprise exactly. More like the particular exhaustion of someone who had already considered this possibility and had been hoping, very quietly, that they were wrong. "I know," she said. That stopped him. "You know." "I suspected. On the road. When things started—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "The coach nearly went over twice before that last time. I had a while to think. He studied her. You suspected the letter was forged, and you kept coming. I had nowhere else to go." It was said simply. No self-pity in it, just the flat, unornamented truth of someone who had burned through their options and was reporting the results. He had no answer for that. He wasn't sure there was one. "Come inside," he said. "Jessette." The cabin was not a welcoming place. Ethan knew that in the abstract way that people know things about themselves that they've long since stopped caring about. It was functional. It was warm. The wood stove in the main room was the size of a small table, and it did its job with the reliability of a well-trained animal. The table was clean because he cleaned it. Mess drove him crazy in a contained space. But the walls were bare. The single window over the kitchen area had no curtain. There were no personal effects visible anywhere. No photographs, no decorative objects, no evidence that anyone lived there who had opinions about anything beyond the purely practical. Margaret had brought all of that with her when they married, 15 years ago. The curtains and the photographs and the small ceramic jar she used to keep on the windowsill with dried wildflowers in it. She'd brought the quality of homeliness to the cabin, the way people carry warmth in themselves. And when she died, all of it had gone with her. He hadn't removed it, exactly. He'd just stopped noticing it was gone until the absence was the only thing left. Violet Hale stood in the middle of the main room and took it in without commenting. She was still doing that cataloging thing. He'd gotten used to it very quickly, which surprised him. "Sit," he said, nodding toward the table. She sat. He put water on for coffee, got the bread he'd baked 2 days ago, and the salt pork he'd had curing since October. He didn't ask what she wanted. She'd said she hadn't eaten since yesterday morning, so what she wanted was food, and opinions about food were a luxury. She didn't argue with any of it. When he set the plate in front of her, she looked at it for just a second. The kind of pause that happens when someone is managing an instinct that's stronger than their composure. And then she ate with the controlled, deliberate manner of someone who was very hungry and very determined not to show how hungry they were. He poured the coffee, sat across from her. "Where did you come from?" he said. "Boston." "Long way." "Yes." He waited. She ate. The fire cracked in the stove. "You want to know why I came?" she said. It wasn't a question. "You said you had nowhere else to go. That covers the why." "Not really." She set down her fork. Not because she was done, the plate was still half full, but because she was going to say something that required her to not be eating. "I came because the letter described a life I thought I could fit into. Hard work. Isolated. A man who needed—" She paused, choosing the word with visible care. "A practical arrangement. I'm not naive. I knew what a mail-order situation was. I wasn't expecting something romantic. I was expecting something honest. And instead you got a forged letter and a near-death experience on a mountain road. And food," she said. "Don't undersell the food." He looked at her. She was looking at the stove, and there was something at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of one. Like she'd caught herself about to make a joke and wasn't sure yet whether that was appropriate. He decided it was. "Coffee's not bad either," he said. "It's actually very good," she said. The ghost of the smile resolved into something real, briefly, and then she picked up her fork and went back to eating, and Ethan Crow sat across from her in his silent, bare-walled cabin and had the deeply unsettling experience of feeling, for the first time in longer than he could accurately remember, like the room had another person in it. He gave her 3 days. That was what he told her, standing in the doorway of the small room at the back of the cabin. The one he'd used for storage since Margaret died. The one he'd spent 2 hours clearing out while Violet sat by the stove with a second cup of coffee and pretended not to notice him working. 3 days, he said. You can rest, get your strength back, figure out your options. After that, I'll be on my way, she said. I understand. I'm not trying to be hard about it. I know. She looked at him steadily. You didn't ask for this. I'm not going to pretend you did. He nodded, left her to sleep. He did not sleep himself. He sat by the stove in the main room long after the fire had dropped to coals, and the temperature in the room had fallen to the point where his breath made faint clouds, and he thought about the letter, about who had written it, about who knew enough about this ranch, and about him to construct something convincing enough to send a woman across the country on the strength of it. The number of people who qualified was small. It got smaller the longer he thought about it, until there was really only one name left, and that name sat in the back of his mind like a coal that was still too hot to touch. Walter Boone. He'd known Walter for over 20 years. They'd come up through the territory together in the days before Colorado was a state, back when the land was something you argued about with your fists and your fence posts and occasionally your rifle. Walter had built his ranch 2 valleys over and married and had 4 kids and visited every Christmas without fail until Ethan had made it clear enough, in his way, that visits weren't something he was interested in anymore. Walter's wife Helen sent food every fall, a crate of preserves and dried goods that appeared on Ethan's porch sometime in October and that Ethan accepted with a note of thanks and consumed without sentiment because food was food, and there was no useful purpose in refusing a kindness. Walter knew the ranch. Walter had once sat in this very room and told Ethan, with the particular blunt honesty of a 20-year friendship, that he was going to kill himself with loneliness if he didn't figure out how to live again. Ethan had told him, with equal directness, to mind his own life. He stared at the cooling stove and thought, Walter, you absolute fool. The next morning, Violet was up before him. This was not expected. He rose at 5, which was earlier than most people and later than cattle demanded, and he came out of his room expecting a quiet house and found instead that a fire was already burning, coffee was already on, and someone had washed and stacked the dishes from last night with a precision that suggested either military background or a very demanding mother. Violet was sitting at the table with her hands around a cup. She was wearing the same dress she'd arrived in, and her hair was still loose. She'd slept on it, and it was a disaster, and she clearly knew it was a disaster because she'd made exactly no effort to fix it, which meant she'd made a decision that fixing it wasn't the point right now. She looked up when he came in. I made coffee, she said. I hope it's your kitchen. I should have asked. It's fine. I also found eggs. I made eggs. There are some left in the pan if you want them. He poured a cup, looked in the pan. She'd cooked them with the salt pork, which was exactly what he would have done. How'd you know where things were? He said. I looked. He sat down across from her. You went through my kitchen. I made you breakfast, she said, with a precision that was also somehow an apology and somehow not an apology, which was a complicated combination, and she was pulling it off better than he'd have expected. He ate the eggs. They were good. I've been thinking, she said after a while. About what? About the 3 days. She set down her cup. I don't want your charity. I want to work for my board. Whatever needs doing, cooking, cleaning, mending, whatever you need, I can do it. I'm not useless. I know you're not useless. You don't know that yet. I know you cooked breakfast in someone else's kitchen without burning the place down. That's not nothing. She looked at him, and there was that measuring thing again, but underneath it now there was something else, something more careful, like she was trying to figure out if he was making fun of her or if he actually meant it, or if those two things could coexist in the same sentence. 1 month, she said. Give me 1 month and I'll earn every night I sleep in that room, and then I'll go. I'll figure something out. He should have said no. He knew he should have said no. He could feel the no sitting right there at the front of his throat, reasonable and uncomplicated and correct. He had a working ranch that he ran alone, that he had organized around being alone, where every system and every routine was calibrated to one person's needs and one person's presence. Bringing another person into that equation didn't make anything easier. He also knew that she had nowhere to go, that Boston was 2,000 miles away and whatever she'd left there was something she hadn't been able to stay for. That the nearest town was 11 miles down a road that was currently drifted badly enough that the coach that brought her up had already turned around and wasn't coming back until the weather broke. He looked at her across the table. Her coffee cup was still warm. She'd made it right. Not too strong, not watered down. She'd figured out the stove damper settings without asking. She was sitting straight in the chair of a man she didn't know, in a mountain she hadn't planned to be on, making the most direct practical argument she could make, because practical arguments were what she had, and she was going to work with what she had. He recognized that. He recognized it the way you recognize something you've seen in the mirror for 15 years. 1 month, he said. The first week was not easy. This is the part of the story where it would be tempting to say they settled into a comfortable rhythm, that two people who were both fundamentally competent simply divided the work and moved around each other without friction. That is not what happened. What happened was that Ethan was a man who had been alone for 15 years and had stopped making any of the social adjustments that living with another person requires. He didn't say when he was going out. He didn't explain where things were kept. He made decisions about the ranch on the fly and executed them without discussion because there had been no one to discuss them with, and the habit of solitude ran very deep. Violet, for her part, was a woman who had strong opinions about how things should be done and a survival instinct that expressed itself as efficiency. She reorganized the kitchen on the third day, not dramatically, not disruptively, just moved several things to positions that made more logical sense from a cooking standpoint. She didn't ask. She just did it. He came in from the afternoon chores and stood in the kitchen and knew immediately that something was different. He spent a good 30 seconds identifying what it was. "You moved things," he said. "The flour was next to the stove," she said, from the table where she was mending one of his shirts, without, he noted, being asked. "It was going to absorb moisture and go stale. It's been there for 4 years. And has it gone stale?" He considered this. "Some. Then I moved it somewhere better." She bit off a thread. "If you want me to move it back, I'll move it back." He looked at the new arrangement. The flour was next to the dry goods shelf, which made more sense. The cast iron was hung by size now instead of by when it had been put away. The spice tins were in a row. "Leave it," he said. She didn't say anything, but he had the impression that she had decided something. The conversations came slowly, not because either of them was unwilling. It was more that they were both people who'd learned to say only what was necessary, and unnecessary words required a kind of trust that didn't appear on demand. But the long evenings helped. In November in the Rockies, darkness came by 4:30, and the cold locked the world outside hard enough that going back out after supper wasn't something you did unless the cattle made you, and the cattle, for once, cooperated. So they sat by the stove. Sometimes she mended. Sometimes he worked on the harness that had needed repairs since August. Sometimes neither of them was doing anything in particular, which was its own kind of comfortable, eventually. On the 8th day, she asked about the photographs. There weren't any. That was the thing. He'd had them, years ago. A wedding portrait, a few others. But at some point, he'd put them away because looking at them had been doing him no good. And at some more recent point, the box he'd put them in had ended up in the storage room, and when he'd cleared the storage room for her, he'd moved the box under his own bed without opening it. "I noticed there were none," she said carefully, not pushing, just acknowledging what she'd observed. "No," he said. "You were married." "Yes." "I'm sorry." 2 words, plain and direct, without the usual performance of sympathy that he'd gotten from people in the years after Margaret died. The excessive condolences, the suggestions about time and healing, the well-meaning but exhausting implication that his grief was a problem to be solved. Just, "I'm sorry." "It was a long time ago," he said. "That doesn't make it smaller." He looked at her. She was looking at the stove, her hand still in her lap, the mending set aside. There was something in her face that he was beginning to recognize, a particular quality of stillness that meant she was speaking from her own experience rather than from what she thought you wanted to hear. "No," he said, "it doesn't." They sat with that for a while. "What happened to you?" he said eventually. "In Boston." She was quiet for long enough that he thought she wasn't going to answer. Then, A man named Raymond Bennett happened to me. The way she said the name, not with anger, which surprised him, but with a kind of cold, careful distance, the way you'd refer to a weather event or a geological feature, something with mass and force, but no relationship to you personally. That told him more than any explanation. He was a businessman, she said, very successful, very... She paused, and there was the careful word-choosing again, well regarded, in certain circles. And you knew him. I worked for him in his office. I was a typist and a bookkeeper. I was good at the work. She said this without pride or apology, just fact. He was interested in me, in a way I didn't understand at first. She stopped. You don't have to, Ethan started. I want to say it. She looked at him. I've been not saying it for months, and it's like carrying something very heavy that you keep telling yourself isn't heavy. He nodded, waited. He wanted me to be his mistress, she said plainly. He was married. He was always going to be married. He wasn't offering me anything except arrangement, discretion, the particular kind of security that comes with being someone's secret. Her voice stayed level. I said no. I said it clearly. And he, she breathed in slowly, made my life impossible after that. How? He told people I'd stolen from him, money, a necklace. He made sure I couldn't get another position in the city. He had friends in the right places and enemies where it counted, and he used both. She looked back at the stove. I couldn't find work. I couldn't pay rent. I had nowhere left that was safe. And then I saw the advertisement for a mail order arrangement in Colorado, and I thought... She stopped again, and then in a voice that had dropped just slightly below level. I thought at least in the mountains no one would know who I was. Ethan didn't say anything for a long moment. This Bennett, he said, he's in Boston. Yes. You think he's going to leave it at that? She turned and looked at him, and something in her expression shifted. No, she said. I don't. She said it the same way she'd said everything else. No drama, no performance. But underneath the steadiness, he heard it. Fear. Not the ordinary kind. The kind that has already thought through the worst-case scenarios and accepted them as possibilities. He had nothing useful to say to that. So he said nothing and poked up the fire, and they sat in the quiet together while the wind moved around the corners of the cabin and the mountains held their silence like a secret. By the third week, something had changed that neither of them put words to. It wasn't dramatic. It was the kind of change that happens in small units. A longer pause before she went to her room at night. A conversation that went past 10 o'clock without either of them noticing. The way he started telling her about the cattle not because she needed to know, but because he'd gotten in the habit of talking to her. She fixed a crack in the front door frame with a piece of wood and a knife she found in the barn. He noticed it 3 days later and didn't say anything, but he thought about it. She laughed at something he said. One of those accidental jokes that happen when you're not trying to be funny, when the truth just comes out at an angle, and the sound of it moved through the cabin like something physical, and Ethan Crow sat very still for a moment afterward, the way you sit still when something has happened that you need to let settle before you examine it. He hadn't heard a woman laugh in that room since Margaret. He hadn't realized until that moment how much he'd been pretending not to notice the silence. On the 21st day, she asked to stay longer. She didn't phrase it as a question, exactly. She'd been thinking it over. He could tell, the way you can tell with someone you've been watching long enough to learn their rhythms. She had the careful word look. I know the month is almost up, she said. 3 days, he said. I know. She folded her hands on the table. I'd like to stay. Not because I have nowhere else to go. I mean, that's still true. But that's not the only reason. He waited. I'm useful here, she said. I know that's a practical argument, but the work matters to me. Being useful matters to me. And She stopped, and for the first time in 3 weeks, the steadiness faltered. Not much, just a small crack in the surface. I don't want to leave yet. He looked at her. Outside, the wind had dropped for the first time in a week. The afternoon light was hitting the snow at an angle that made the whole valley below the ranch look like something someone had painted to be beautiful on purpose. All right, he said. All right. Stay, He stood up and picked up his coat from the peg. The east fence needs checking before the next storm. I'll be back by dark. He was at the door when she said, Ethan. He stopped. Thank you, she said. He didn't look back. Don't thank me yet, he said. Winter's not even half over. He went out into the cold, and he stood on the porch for a moment before stepping off it, and the mountains were all around him in their silence, and he breathed the sharp air and thought about nothing in particular and everything at once. The cabin behind him felt different than it had yesterday. He wasn't ready to say what that meant. He might never be ready, but he noticed it, walking out to the fence in the long slant of afternoon light. He noticed it, and he did not try to argue himself out of it. That, in itself, was something new. Ma'am. The month became 2. The cold deepened. And somewhere far to the east, in a city of cobblestones and gaslight and power concentrated in the hands of men who never forgot a refusal, a man named Raymond Bennett was reading a letter from a private inquiry agent in Denver. The letter contained an address, and Raymond Bennett, who had destroyed softer obstacles than a Colorado mountain rancher, reached for his pen. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Ethan rode down to Harwick to collect supplies and found it waiting at the post office. A single envelope with his name written in handwriting he recognized before he'd finished reading the return address. He stood at the post office counter for a moment, turning it over in his hands, then tucked it into his coat pocket, and didn't open it until he was back on the road, sitting on the wagon seat with the horses stopped and the pine trees pressing in close on both sides, and no one around to watch his face while he read. Ethan, I know you know it was me. I'm not going to insult you by pretending otherwise. I also know you're probably angry enough to ride over here and say so in person, and if that's what you need to do, come ahead. I'll have coffee on. But before you do, I want you to think about the last time you laughed. Not smiled, laughed. Really think about it, because I tried to remember and I couldn't come up with an answer, and I've known you for 20 years. Walter. Ethan folded the letter, put it back in his pocket, clicked the horses forward. He was angry. He'd been angry since the night he'd sat by the cooling stove and worked out the arithmetic of who knew enough to write that letter, and the anger had settled into something low and steady over the following weeks. The kind of anger that doesn't burn hot because it's too certain of itself to need to. But the question Walter had asked was sitting in his chest in a way he couldn't dislodge, and he was honest enough with himself to know why. He couldn't answer it either. He got back to the ranch in the late afternoon and found Violet in the barn, which was not where he'd left her. She'd taken it upon herself to mend a section of the hay storage partition that had been sagging since September. He could see she'd done it with a piece of barn board and 4 nails, and done it correctly, which was more irritating than if she'd done it wrong because it meant he had no grounds for objection. There's a loose board on the left stall gate, too, she said, without looking up from the partition. I know. I didn't touch it because I wasn't sure which tools you wanted used on it. He set down the supplies he'd carried in. You could have asked. You weren't here. He looked at her. She was wearing one of his old work coats over her dress, the one he kept on the barn hook for cold mornings, and she'd rolled the sleeves up, and there was sawdust on her forearms, and her hair was doing what it always did in the wind, which was whatever it wanted. She looked entirely unbothered by this. Walter Boone wrote the letter, he said. She stopped what she was doing and turned around. Your friend. 20 years. Why? He pulled the letter from his pocket and held it out. She read it. He watched her face because he'd gotten better at reading it over the past weeks, the small calibrations of expression that told you where she actually was underneath the controlled surface. When she finished, she handed it back. He was trying to help you, she said. He lied to you. He sent you across the country on a forged document. Yes. She leaned against the partition. And you could have put me back on the coach that first day. You didn't. He didn't have a response to that, which was happening more often than he was comfortable with. Are you going to confront him? She said. I'm thinking about it. What would you say? That he had no right. She was quiet for a moment, looking at him with that direct, considering look. Would that be the whole truth? She said. He put the letter back in his pocket, picked up the supply boxes. I'll look at that stall gate tomorrow, he said, and went inside. She didn't follow him immediately, and he was grateful for that. She'd learned in the weeks they'd been sharing the space the difference between solitude and avoidance, and she respected the former while seeing straight through the latter. It was an uncomfortable quality in a person. He was getting used to it, He didn't write to Walter that week, or the week after. He kept the letter in his coat pocket, and it wore soft at the creases from being folded and unfolded. And once or twice in the evening, when the fire had burned down and the room was quiet, he almost said something out loud about it, almost started a conversation he hadn't figured out how to have. But the words didn't come. They weren't ready. What happened instead was December. December in the high Rockies was its own kind of world. The snow came in earnest. Not the light testing the ground snowfall of November, but the real thing, 4 and 5 feet at a time, the kind that buried fence posts and made the cattle stupid with stress and turned the mountain road into a theoretical concept rather than an actual passable surface. The ranch closed in on itself the way it always did, the circle of viable reality shrinking to the barn, the cabin, and the 40 feet between them. For two people who had been coexisting with careful distance, this was an adjustment. There was no avoiding each other. There was no retreating to opposite ends of anything large enough to provide genuine privacy. They were in each other's space the way people on a ship are in each other's space, by necessity, without alternative, and with the gradual, reluctant understanding that the only way through was negotiation. Some of it was small. He needed quiet in the mornings before he'd had coffee. She needed, it turned out, to talk through whatever she'd been thinking about while she slept, which was a lot and came out fast. They compromised. Half a cup of coffee first, then conversation. It worked well enough, except for the days when she'd been thinking about something that couldn't wait, and those days he just drank the coffee faster. Some of it was larger. One evening, in the second week of December, he came in from the barn to find the cabin smelling like something he hadn't smelled in years. It took him a full 30 seconds to identify it. Cinnamon and something baked. The warm, specific smell of a kitchen that was being used for something beyond pure sustenance. Violet was at the stove with her back to him, and on the table there was a pan of something that looked irregular and imperfect and wildly out of place in this utilitarian space. "What is that?" he said. "Apple cake." She didn't turn around. "Don't read into it. There were dried apples in the back of the pantry, and they were going to be useless by spring. I know where the apples were." "Then you know they needed using." She brought the pan to the table. It was indeed irregular, darker on one side where the stove ran hot, slightly collapsed in the middle, nothing like what he imagined apple cake was supposed to look like. He cut a piece anyway, ate it standing at the table because he hadn't taken off his coat yet. It was very good. "It's not pretty," she said, watching him, a defensive note in her voice that was more endearing than she would have wanted it to be. "I didn't say anything. You had a face." "I don't have faces." "You absolutely have faces. You have at least 4 that I've cataloged." She sat down and cut herself a piece. "There's the one where something surprised you, and you don't want to admit it. The one where you disagree with me, but you've decided it's not worth arguing. The one you make when the cattle are being difficult. What's the 4th? She paused, looked at her plate. "I'm still working on what that one means," she said, and moved on before he could ask her to finish the thought. They ate the irregular cake by the stove, and he told her about the east pasture fence that was going to need serious work in the spring. And she told him about a dream she'd had about Boston that she'd spent the morning trying to shake. And it was so natural and unremarkable and ordinary that it didn't register as anything significant until much later, when Ethan was lying in the dark of his room and thinking about the day, and realized that he had told her something about the spring. The spring. 4 months away. He'd said the east pasture fence needs serious work in the spring without thinking about it, without calculating, without stopping to register that the spring was a future that included her in it by assumption. He lay in the dark for a while with that. Then he went to sleep, because the cattle were going to need checking at first light regardless of what he was feeling, and feeling things had to be scheduled around practical reality, which was probably a character flaw, but was also just the truth of the life he'd built. The next morning, she told him about Raymond Bennett. Not everything. Not yet. But more than she'd said before. She'd been building toward it, he thought, adding details in small increments over the weeks. The way you add weight to something you're not sure can bear it, testing the structure before you commit. She told him about this office on Commonwealth Avenue. The way Bennett had a particular way of looking at the women who worked for him. Not overtly threatening, nothing you could point to and call wrong, just a quality of attention that made you aware of being looked at. She'd thought at first that she was imagining it. Everyone thought he was generous, she said. They were at the table, coffee cups between them. the morning quiet around them the way it got when the snow was heavy. He gave money to the library. He was on the board of something charitable, I can't remember what. He had a wife who wore good clothes and smiled at everyone. But, Ethan said, but he came to my desk one evening in September when everyone else had gone home. She looked at her coffee cup. He wasn't threatening. He was very pleasant about it, actually. That was the part that was hardest to explain to people later. He made it sound like an arrangement that was good for both of us, like I was being offered something. What did you say? I said no. I said it politely because I still needed the job. I thought, she stopped. I thought that would be enough. I thought a polite no from a woman with no power and no connections would be sufficient. Ethan was quiet. The next week, she said, the petty cash box came up short, $40. I had handled the box. That was all anyone needed to know. She set down her cup. He was very sorry about it, very concerned. He didn't want to involve the authorities, he said. He thought perhaps there was an explanation. He gave me a week to return the money. Money you hadn't taken. Money I hadn't taken. She looked out the window. The snow was still falling. Had been falling since yesterday. I couldn't return what I didn't have. At the end of the week, he went to the authorities himself, very regretfully. There was something in her voice then, not quite bitterness, more like the exhausted acknowledgement of a system that had worked exactly as designed. And then he was very kind about not pressing full charges, so that people felt he was being merciful. And then he made sure every business in the city that might have hired me knew why I'd left the previous position. Ethan had not moved in the last several minutes. He was aware of his own stillness, of the way his hands had settled flat on the table. How long did it take, he said carefully, before you left? 3 months. I had savings. They ran out. She turned back from the window and looked at him with the directness that was her natural state, and he could see the cost of telling it clearly in the set of her jaw, the steadiness that was not easy but was chosen. I answered the advertisement 2 weeks before I would have had no choice left at all. He thought about the woman who had stepped out of that coach, the controlled eating, the grip on the seat when her legs gave out, the way she'd said I had nowhere else to go with a flatness that had told him it was the simple truth and not a dramatic statement. He thought about Walter's letter in his coat pocket. You said before, he said slowly, that you didn't think he was going to leave it at Boston. No. What do you think he does next? She was quiet for a moment. The fire shifted in the stove. He finds out where I went, she said. He's thorough. He has money to be thorough. She looked at her hands. And then I think he does whatever damages me most. That's what he does. He doesn't lose. It's important to him not to lose. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. At the woman sitting at his table in his kitchen in the middle of a Colorado winter, who had mended his clothes and moved his flour and reorganized his cast iron and made an imperfect apple cake and told him the truth when she could have told him something softer. When something comes, he said, and I think you're right that something comes, we'll deal with it. She looked at him. Ethan, I didn't say it would be easy. I said we'd deal with it. She opened her mouth and then closed it. And something happened in her face that she didn't quite manage to control. A brief, involuntary crack in the surface, gone almost before it was visible. She looked back down at her coffee. All right, she said quietly. He poured them both more coffee because that was something to do with his hands. And outside the snow kept coming, and the cabin was warm, and neither of them said anything more for a while. But the silence was different than it had been in November. It had company in it now. It had weight and heat, and the particular quality of shared understanding that doesn't need words to exist. By Christmas, which they didn't celebrate exactly, but acknowledged, in the sense that Violet made something more elaborate for dinner, and Ethan came in from the barn at a reasonable hour, and they sat together by the fire until past midnight, talking about things that had nothing to do with cattle or fences or men in Boston. The cabin had become something neither of them had a precise word for. It wasn't his place anymore, in the way it had been his place for 15 years. It wasn't entirely hers. It was something in between, which is to say it was becoming a home, which is a different thing from a house in ways that are easier to feel than to explain. The photographs were still under the bed in their box. He hadn't taken them out. But one evening he'd mentioned Margaret's name in passing. Something small, a memory connected to the wood stove, a story without any particular pain in it. and the fact that the name had come out without costing him something was itself a kind of information. The east fence needed work in the spring. He was starting to think about the spring. January came in hard, the kind of cold that didn't just sit on the land but pressed into it, into the barn boards and the fence posts and the gaps around the window frames that Ethan had chinked twice already and would need to chink again before February. The cattle bunched together in the pasture and breathed clouds and moved as little as possible, which was the only sensible response to 12 degrees below zero. Ethan spent his mornings breaking ice in the water troughs with an axe, a job he'd done alone for 15 years without thinking much about it, and spent his afternoons doing the 100 other small, urgent things that a ranch in deep winter demanded. Violet brought him coffee at the water trough on the fourth morning. She appeared at the barn door with 2 cups and crossed the yard without comment and held one out to him. She was wearing his old coat again and a pair of his work gloves that were too large for her hands and a scarf wrapped twice around her head in a way that should have looked ridiculous and somehow didn't. He took the cup, drank it standing in the cold beside the trough, with ice chips still floating in the dark water and the steam rising off both cups and the mountains white and absolute in every direction. "You didn't have to come out," he said. "The coffee was going to get cold either way," she said. "Seemed more useful to bring it to you." He looked at her sideways. She was looking at the mountains with the expression she got sometimes. Not wistful exactly, but the look of someone filing something away, like she was memorizing the view in case she needed it later. "Does it get like this every January?" she asked. "Most years. Sometimes February's worse." She absorbed this without complaint. That was a thing he'd learned about her. She didn't complain about conditions. She complained about injustice, about dishonesty, about things that were within human power to fix and hadn't been. But weather, cold, hard work, physical discomfort, those she accepted the way you accept arithmetic. Facts didn't need her opinion. They drank the coffee. The wind moved across the pasture and lifted a skin of snow off the top of the nearest drift and scattered it sideways in a sheet of white. "Walter Boone sent a letter," Ethan said, "asking if you settled in all right." She turned to look at him. "You wrote to him?" "He wrote first," I answered. "What did you say?" He took another drink of coffee. "I said you were here." Something moved across her face. Not quite a smile. More like the expression of someone who has asked a small question and received an answer that was larger than expected and is deciding how to hold it. "That's all?" she said. That's all he needed to know. She looked back at the mountains. "Are you still angry at him?" Ethan thought about it honestly. "Some," he said. "Less than I was. Because it worked out. Because—" He stopped and started again more carefully. "Because I understand why he did it, even if the way he did it was wrong. Those aren't the same thing, but they can both be true." She was quiet for a moment. "That's a more generous reading than most people would give it. Walter's a good man who made a bad decision. I've been a bad man who made good ones. It balances out eventually." She looked at him then with the full weight of that gray-green attention, and he felt it the way you feel an unexpected change in temperature. Not unpleasant, just suddenly, completely aware. "You're not a bad man," she said. "I didn't say I was. I said I'd made bad decisions." "What kind?" He drained the last of his coffee. "The kind that take 15 years to correct," he said, and went back to the ice. She stood there a moment longer, holding her empty cup, and then went back inside. He heard the cabin door close from 50 feet away, and the sound of it was different than it used to be. It used to be just a sound. Now it meant someone was in there. That distinction was becoming harder to ignore. It was Walter's visit, 2 weeks later, that cracked things open. He showed up on a Thursday with no warning, which was Walter's way, and had always been Walter's way because he held that announced visits gave people too much time to arrange their faces. He was a big man, broad across the shoulders, with a gray beard he'd been threatening to shave for a decade and hadn't. He pulled up to the gate in his own wagon and climbed down and stood there waiting to see how the land lay before committing to the yard. Ethan came out of his barn and stood on the other side of the fence. They looked at each other. "Well," Walter said. "Well," Ethan said. A pause, long enough to be its own statement. "You going to open the gate?" Walter said. "Or are we doing this through the fence like a couple of arguing neighbors?" Ethan opened the gate. They went inside because the cold demanded it. Violet took one look at Walter and offered him coffee with the particular gracious efficiency of someone who understood that whatever was about to happen in this room didn't need an audience, but did need something warm to hold. She put the cups on the table and took her mending to the chair by the stove and became very involved in it. Walter sat down, wrapped his hands around the cup, looked at the room with the expression of a man cataloging changes. "You moved the flower," he said. "She did," Ethan said. Walter looked at Violet. "Better spot for it," he said. "Thank you," she said, without looking up from the mending. Walter looked back at Ethan. He had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable, which was not a state he occupied often. "I'm not going to apologize for the intent," he said. "I'll apologize for the method. The letter was wrong. Sending her across the country without her knowing the full, that was wrong, and I knew it was wrong when I did it, and I did it anyway." "Yes," Ethan said. "That's all you've got?" "Yes." "What do you want me to say, Walter?" "I don't know. Something. You've had 2 months to think of something." Ethan looked at him across the table. Walter, who'd sat with him through the worst winter after Margaret died, and hadn't said a single word about healing or moving on, had just made coffee and shown up every few weeks, and been present in the way that some people know how to be present, which is mostly just by not leaving. Walter, who apparently had decided at some point that presence wasn't enough, and had taken matters into his own hands in the most characteristically Walter way possible. "You should have told me," Ethan said. "If you were that worried, you should have said it plainly." "I did say it plainly 3 years ago, and I told you to mind your own life." "Yes, you did." Walter took a drink of coffee. "And you were wrong, and I knew you were wrong, and I let you be wrong for 3 more years before I decided that respecting your choices was doing you more harm than good." The room was quiet enough that the fire in the stove was audible. "I'm still angry," Ethan said. "I know it. But—" He stopped, looked at the table. She needed somewhere safe, and this was safe. Whatever else the situation was, this was that. He hadn't looked at Violet while saying it, but he was aware, in the peripheral animal way he'd gotten aware of her in the last 2 months, that she had gone very still in the chair. Walter looked between the two of them with the expression of a man who has asked a question he already knows the answer to. "Well," he said again, and then, with the restraint of someone exercising genuine self-control, "I'll drink my coffee and say nothing more about it." "Thank you," Ethan said. You're welcome." He drank his coffee. "The east fence looks rough." "I know. I've got extra post stock from the fall. I'll bring it down in March when the ground softens." "You don't have to." "I know I don't." Walter set down the cup. "Ethan, I've known you for 20 years. Let me bring the damn post stock." From across the room, very quietly, Violet laughed. It was the small, involuntary laugh of someone who has been trying not to laugh and lost the fight, and it broke the remaining tension in the room as cleanly as anything could have. Walter looked at her with an expression of profound satisfaction that he was only partially hiding. "She laughs," he said to Ethan. "The cabin has laughing in it." "Don't," Ethan said. "I'm just noting." "Walter." "Drinking my coffee," Walter said, and did. He stayed 2 hours and left before dark because the road demanded it. Ethan walked him to the gate, and Walter paused with his hand on the wagon side and looked at the cabin, at the lamp burning warm in the window. "She's a good woman," he said. Not a question. "Yes," Ethan said, simply, without qualification. Walter nodded once and climbed up and drove away without looking back, which was also very Walter. Ethan stood at the gate until the wagon rounded the tree line and disappeared. The cold was serious by now, the kind that made the inside of your nose feel crystalline when you breathed in, and he should have gone inside. He stood there a little longer anyway. The lamp in the window, the shape of the cabin against the white mountains, the smoke going up straight from the chimney into a sky so clear it was almost purple. He went inside. The evening that followed was ordinary in its surface details. Supper. The fire. He worked on the harness, and she read from the small collection of books she'd brought, one of the only pieces of her former life she'd managed to carry, a half-dozen novels packed into the bottom of her bag with the pragmatic prioritization of someone who understood that certain things were as necessary as food. But something was different in the air between them. had been different since the morning at the water trough, and it wasn't going away. He noticed the exact moment she stopped reading, not because of any sound, but because the quality of her stillness changed, from the active stillness of someone absorbed in a page to the different stillness of someone who has set the page down internally, even if the book is still open. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." She looked at him directly. It was after 9 o'clock, and the fire had dropped low, and the lamp between them made the light close and warm. "What did you mean this morning?" she said. "The kind of decisions that take 15 years to correct." He set down the harness. He'd known this was coming in the way you sometimes know things without being able to articulate the mechanism. "After Margaret died," he said, slowly, "I stopped. Everything that wasn't strictly necessary, I stopped. Told myself it was grief, told myself I needed time, and then time passed and I was still stopped, and I told myself that was just who I was now. But it wasn't. It was a choice. I just dressed it up as something that happened to me instead of something I did." Violet was quiet. Her book was closed now, held in both hands in her lap. "I did that too," she said. "After Bennett. I told myself I was practical, that I was being realistic about what the world was. But it was—" She paused. "It was safer to not expect anything, then nothing could be taken." He nodded. He understood that arithmetic exactly. "Ethan," she said. "Yeah." She looked at him, and he looked at her, and the fire cracked once in the stove, and she said, "I don't want to leave in the spring." The words landed in the room and stayed there. "I know that's—" she started. "I don't want you to leave," he said. It came out without planning, which was the only way it could have come out. Planned, he would have weighed it to death, found 15 reasons for caution, presented it with enough qualifications to drain it of meaning. Instead, it just fell out of him, simple and complete and true. She looked at him for a long moment. He could see the place in her where the response was forming. Not the controlled, measured response she used as default, but something underneath that. "I'm afraid of that," she said. "Of what?" "Of wanting something." Her voice dropped slightly. "I've been wrong about things being safe before." "I know." He leaned forward, elbows on the table, because this required proximity, required her to be able to read his face the way she'd learned to. "I'm not asking you to not be afraid. I'm asking you to stay anyway." She looked at him for a long time. He let her look. He didn't rush it or fill the silence. Then she stood up from the chair, and he stood up from the table, and she crossed the room to him, and he met her halfway, and he kissed her in the lamplight, with the fire low and the mountains outside full of dark and cold, and it was nothing like the careful managed exchange of two people being sensible. It was 15 years of silence ending badly and correctly and all at once. When they stepped back from each other, she had one hand pressed flat against his chest, and her eyes were bright with something that was not entirely comfortable, and not entirely sad, and not entirely either. "I'm still afraid," she said. "Yeah," he said. "Me too." She made a sound that was almost a laugh. Not a happy one, exactly, but the sound of someone who has recognized a truth about themselves and found it unexpectedly companionable. They stood there at the middle of the cabin floor for a while without moving, his hand at her waist and her hand on his chest, and the lamp burning between where they'd been sitting, and neither of them said anything else because there wasn't anything else necessary. 3 days later, the riders came. Ethan saw them from the pasture, 3 men on horseback, moving up the road from Harwick with the deliberate pace of people who knew where they were going and had no particular reason to hurry. They weren't locals. He knew every rider in this valley and the next by the way they sat a horse, and these men sat theirs wrong. Too upright, too careful. Men who rode because it was necessary, not because it was natural. He was at the gate when they arrived. The one in front was perhaps 40, with a city-cut coat that was fighting the altitude and losing, and a manner that was accustomed to being deferred to. He looked at Ethan with the assessing attention of someone who had been briefed. "Mr. Crow," he said. Not a question. "Who's asking?" "My name is Delacroix. I represent certain interests of Mr. Raymond Bennett of Boston. We're looking for a woman named Violet Hale. We have information she may be residing on your property." The cold seemed to sharpen itself. "You have information," Ethan said. "That's correct. Mr. Bennett is seeking the return of property taken from his business, and the woman, what property? Delacroix reached into his coat and produced a document, held it out. Ethan didn't take it. Currency and jewelry, Delacroix said. The amount is substantial. Mr. Bennett has been generous in not pursuing criminal charges to this point, but his patience has... You rode 11 miles up a mountain in January, Ethan said, to deliver a message from a patient man. Delacroix's mouth thinned. Mr. Crow, this is a legal matter. You're on my land, Ethan said. I didn't invite you here. I'd like you to leave. The second rider shifted in his saddle. The third was looking at the cabin. Ethan noted both movements with the peripheral attention that 15 years of being alone on a mountain had sharpened into something close to instinct. We'll need to speak with Miss Hale, Delacroix said. No, Ethan said. You'll need to leave. A pause. Delacroix looked at him with the particular calculation of a man deciding whether the obstacle in front of him was bluffing. He appeared to reach a conclusion because he folded the document back into his coat. We'll be in Harwick, he said. This isn't finished, Mr. Crow. I didn't think it was, Ethan said. He watched them ride back down the road until they were out of sight, and then stayed at the gate a while longer in the cold, thinking. Then he went inside. Violet was at the table. She'd heard the horses. He could see it in her face. The controlled surface was perfectly in place, which was how he knew what it was costing her. He sat down across from her. 3 men, sent by Bennett. What did they say? He told her plainly. She listened without interruption, her hands flat on the table. When he finished, she let out a slow breath. He found me faster than I expected. You expected him to find you. I told you I did. She looked at him. This is the part where it gets bad, Ethan. I know. He won't stop at messengers. He'll come himself, or he'll send someone with more authority. He has... She stopped, pressed her lips together. He has money and connections, and the particular anger of someone who isn't used to being refused. He destroyed me once from 2,000 miles away. Here, he can do it in person. The fire in the stove ticked. Outside, the wind was picking up again. He hasn't counted on one thing, Ethan said. What? Ethan looked at her steadily. He's never had to deal with anyone who had nothing left to lose and didn't care what it cost. She looked at him for a long moment, and something behind her eyes shifted. Not reassurance, exactly. More complex than that. The look of someone who has spent a long time being afraid and has just, very quietly, decided to be something else instead. We need a plan, she said. Yes, he said. We do. She straightened into the chair, pulled a piece of paper from the shelf behind her, put it on the table between them. The old practical efficiency was back in her face, but it was mixed now with something that hadn't been there before. Something that looked, in the firelight, remarkably like anger. Good, Ethan thought. Anger was useful. Anger meant she'd stopped waiting for someone else to fix it. Outside the cabin, the wind came down off the northern peaks hard and cold and indifferent, the way it always did. The mountains didn't care what happened in the valleys below them. They just stood there, enormous and patient, waiting out everything. But inside, the lamp was burning, and 2 people who had been separately afraid for a very long time were sitting at a table together, finally making plans. The plan, such as it was, started with a secret Violet hadn't told him yet. She told him the night after the riders left, when the wind had dropped and the cabin was quiet enough that every word had weight. She'd been sitting across from him at the table with the blank paper between them for 20 minutes, and he'd been waiting because he'd learned by now that she moved toward difficult things at her own pace, and pushing never helped. Before I left Boston, she said, I took something from Bennett's office. He looked at her. Not money, not jewelry. She held his gaze. Ledgers, financial records, 3 years of them, covering accounts he kept separate from his legitimate business. I'd been handling his books long enough to understand what I was looking at. She paused. He had been stealing from his own investors for years, diverting funds into private accounts, falsifying returns, covering losses with money that belonged to other people, wealthy people, people with lawyers. The fire shifted in the stove. How much? Ethan said. Enough to ruin him completely. Enough that the men he'd been stealing from would want him prosecuted rather than quietly managed. She looked at her hands on the table. I copied what I could in 2 nights. Then I took the copies to the one person I trusted absolutely. Who? Sister Eleanor. She runs an orphanage on the east side of the city. I'd volunteered there for 2 years before everything. She's the most honest person I've ever known, and she has no connection to Bennett's world. I gave her the documents and told her to hold them until she heard from me. Ethan was quiet for a moment. You've had a way to destroy him this whole time. I've had evidence. That's not the same as having a way. Evidence only works if someone with authority is willing to look at it. And in Boston, Bennett owns most of the authority worth having. She looked up. But out here, he doesn't know this territory. He doesn't have the relationships he has back east. If we can get those documents to the right judge before he can arrange things otherwise, we send for Sister Eleanor. Yes. She said it with the simplicity of someone who had been carrying this plan alone for months and was finally saying it out loud. I need to send her a telegram. Tell her to come. Tell her to bring everything. He nodded slowly. That takes time. The telegraph office is in Harwick. Bennett's men are in Harwick. I know. If they're watching the telegraph office, then we send someone they're not watching. She looked at him steadily. Walter. Ethan sat with that for a moment. Then he almost smiled, which was as close as he got to smiling when things were serious. He'd be furious if we didn't ask him. I thought so too. He rode to Walter's ranch the next morning before full light. Walter listened to the entire story standing in his own kitchen in his long underwear and boots, arms crossed, with the expression of a man who is absorbing information and calibrating his outrage simultaneously. When Ethan finished, Walter said nothing for 10 seconds. Then, she had the documents this whole time. Yes. And she came here anyway. She had nowhere else to go. I told you that part. You told me she said that. I didn't understand the full picture. Walter uncrossed his arms, picked up his coat from the hook. I'll go to Harwick today. I'll send the telegram myself, and I'll do it from the dry goods counter while buying flour, because Delacroix and his people don't know me, and flour gives a man a reason to be in a store. He paused. This is going to get worse before it gets better. Yes, Ethan said. Bennett's going to come himself. Probably. Walter looked at him with 20 years of friendship behind his eyes. You ready for that? No, Ethan said honestly. But it doesn't matter. Walter nodded once. Go home, he said. I'll handle the telegram. Ethan got back to the ranch by mid-morning. He didn't tell Violet about the conversation with Walter in detail, just that it was handled, that the telegram would go today. She received this with a nod and went back to what she'd been doing, which was mending the same shirt she'd been mending for 3 days because her hands needed something to do while her mind worked. They waited. Waiting was its own particular cruelty. There was nothing to do with the anxiety except carry it around the ranch in the cold, doing the daily work that the cattle demanded regardless of anything else. Ethan checked the water troughs. He repaired the loose board on the stall gate that she'd pointed out in November. He did the work the same way he'd done it for 15 years, except that now there was someone at the cabin window sometimes when he looked up, a shape moving behind the glass. And that shape meant something to him that he was still figuring out how to hold. On the third day, Delacroix's men rode back up the mountain. This time there were 5 of them. The 2 extra were local. He could tell by the horses, by the way they sat, by the fact that one of them was a deputy's badge that caught the flat winter light. Harwick's deputy sheriff was a man named Colfax, who Ethan had no strong feelings about in either direction, which was about to change. Ethan was at the gate again. He was always at the gate when they came. It was the narrowest point, the place where numbers mattered least. Delacroix had a piece of paper this time. Mr. Crow. His voice had a different quality now, more formal. He'd found his authority in the 3 days between visits. I have a warrant for the arrest of Violet Hale on charges of theft and fraud issued by the Territorial Court at Denver. Deputy Colfax is here to execute it. Colfax looked uncomfortable, which was information. Let me see it, Ethan said. Delacroix handed it down. Ethan read it carefully. It was genuine, or genuine enough, which was what money could buy if you had the right people in the right offices and enough time to arrange paperwork. The charge was listed as $3,000 in currency and a pearl necklace valued at $1,200. He handed it back. I want to speak to her first, he said. That's not... She's going to come out of that cabin and get on a horse in 12-degree weather and ride to town. You can give me 5 minutes to talk to her first, or you can come take her yourself, and we can see how that goes." He looked at Colfax, not Delacroix. "Deputy?" Colfax looked at the warrant, looked at Ethan, looked at the 4 men behind him, 2 of whom were not local and not his people. "5 minutes," Colfax said. Delacroix started to object. Colfax looked at him briefly and he stopped. Ethan went inside. Violet was standing in the middle of the room. She'd heard the horses, heard the voices carrying through the cold air, and she'd already reached her own conclusions. She was wearing her coat. Her bag was sitting on the table. She'd packed it. He looked at the bag. Something moved in his chest, cold and sharp. "You heard," he said. "Yes." Her voice was perfectly steady. "It's a warrant." "Looks legitimate. Bennett's been busy." She nodded. She knew this was coming. She'd known it was coming since November, from the night she'd told him about Bennett over cold coffee and a dying fire. She'd been packing that bag in her mind for months. "I need you to not do anything," she said. He looked at her. "Violet, listen to me." She took a step toward him, and her eyes were direct and fierce and entirely clear. "If you fight them here, it makes it worse. It makes you an outlaw, and it gives Bennett exactly what he wants. A reason to take everything, including this ranch, including whatever rights either of us have going forward. The only way we win this is in the open, in front of people, where his lies have to stand up next to the truth. And if the truth isn't enough, it has to be." She said it not as optimism, but as the flat refusal to accept an alternative. "Eleanor is coming. The documents are coming. We just need enough time." He stood there in the middle of the cabin floor and looked at her. This woman, who had arrived 4 months ago with a forged letter and hollow cheekbones, and enough stubborn practicality to reorganize his kitchen and his entire internal landscape. And he thought about what enough time meant when someone was being taken to a jail in a town 11 miles down the mountain. "I'll get you out," he said. "I know you'll try." "That's not what I said." She looked at him for a moment. Then she reached up and put her hand against his jaw, briefly, the way you touch something you're not sure you'll see again. "Don't do anything that can't be undone," she said. "Promise me." He covered her hand with his. "All right." She picked up her bag. He walked her out to where the horses were waiting, and he watched Colfax help her mount with more courtesy than the situation strictly required, which told him Colfax at least had some remaining decency in him. Delacroix looked satisfied in the particular way of men who have confused legal authority with personal victory. They rode down the mountain. Ethan stood at the gate until they were out of sight, and then he went inside and stood in the middle of the empty cabin, and the silence was different from any silence he'd lived in for 15 years. It was not the silence of solitude. It was the silence of something taken. He did not stand there long. He rode to Walter's before noon. Walter already knew news moved fast in small territories, and Colfax had a wife who had a particular relationship with information. Walter met him at the door with the expression of a man who has been expecting this and hates being right. "She's in the county lockup," Walter said. "For now. Delacroix is trying to arrange a transfer to Denver." "How long do we have?" 3-4 days, if we're lucky. The road's still rough enough that moving a prisoner isn't simple." Walter folded his arms. "Eleanor?" "No word yet. It's been 3 days. Boston is a long way." "I know it is." Walter was quiet for a moment. "Ethan, if the documents don't come, they'll come. But if they don't, Walter," he looked at him, "they'll come." Walter looked back at him for a long moment, and whatever he saw in Ethan's face apparently settled something, because he uncrossed his arms and reached for his coat. "I'm coming to town with you," he said. "Don't argue." He didn't argue. Harwick in February was the kind of small that turned everyone into everyone else's business. 300 people, 1 main street, 1 hotel that doubled as a boarding house, 1 saloon that was also the best source of territorial news. The arrest of a woman at the Crow Ranch had made its way through every establishment by the time Ethan and Walter rode in, and he could feel the town watching him from behind windows and over counter edges as he tied his horse at the rail outside the sheriff's office. The sheriff was a man named Aldous Pruitt, 60 years old, with the careful temperament of someone who had survived 2 territories and intended to survive a 3rd. He received Ethan in his office with the expression of a man who already has a headache and can see more coming. "She's comfortable," Pruitt said before Ethan could ask. She's in the back room, not the cell. I'm not putting a woman in that cell over a business dispute from Boston. Delacroix know that. Delacroix can have an opinion. Pruitt leaned back in his chair. I've been reading this warrant, Ethan. It's legal. I can't ignore a legal warrant. I know. But the man who arranged it showed up here 3 days before it was issued, which is interesting timing, and the witnesses named on it are 2 men who rode in with him from out of state, and I've been doing this long enough to know what that smells like. What does it smell like? Like someone who bought what they needed and is hoping I don't look too hard at the receipt. Pruitt looked at him steadily. She got anyone who can speak for her? Someone's coming from Boston. Should be here inside a week. I can hold the transfer request for a week. Maybe a little longer if the road cooperates. I appreciate it. Don't appreciate it yet. Bennett's arriving tomorrow. The words sat in the room. Tomorrow, Ethan said. Came in on the wire this afternoon. He's bringing his own lawyer and 2 additional witnesses. Pruitt's voice was carefully neutral. Man moves fast when he wants something. Ethan rode to the hotel and arranged a room for himself for the next week. He paid in cash because that was what he had, and he wasn't going to apologize for it. Then he went to the back room of the sheriff's office, where Violet was being held. Not a cell, as Pruitt had said, but a storeroom with a cot and a lamp and a window that looked out on the alley. She looked up when he came in. She'd been reading. Of course she had. She'd brought a book. And she lowered it with the expression of someone who has been waiting but won't say so. Pruitt's decent, he said. I know. He brought me supper. She paused. Bennett's coming. Tomorrow. She absorbed this. How much time do we have? Pruitt can hold the transfer a week, maybe more. Eleanor needs to be here before the hearing. I know. She set the book down on the cot and looked at him through the lamplight. She looked tired. Not broken, not defeated. Just tired in the way of someone who has been carrying a weight at a particular angle for a long time, and the muscles are starting to register it. I keep thinking about the flower, she said. He blinked. What? The flower. When I moved it from next to the stove. You said it had been there 4 years. She looked at her hands. 4 years of slightly stale flour because there was no one to notice it should be somewhere else. She paused. I don't want to go back to being someone who has nowhere to notice things. He pulled the chair from the corner and sat down close enough that the lamp was between them, throwing light on both their faces. You're not going back to anything, he said. You don't know that. I know it the same way I know the east fence needs work in the spring. Some things you just know. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. We are going to get through the next week. Eleanor's coming with the ledgers and the letters and everything she has, and we're going to put it in front of a judge and let Bennett's entire constructed life fall apart in public where everyone can see it. She looked at him. And if something goes wrong, something will go wrong. Something always goes wrong. We'll deal with it when it does. She almost laughed. The same almost laugh from the cabin, the one that happened when reality said something too bleak to be purely tragic. That's not exactly comforting. No, but it's true. She leaned back against the wall and looked at the ceiling for a moment. I keep thinking about what he's going to say. Bennett, he's very good at saying things. He makes everything sound completely reasonable even when it's completely wrong. Let him, Ethan said. Let him say everything he's got. Because when Eleanor walks into that room with 3 years of financial records, everything he said is going to have to sit next to the truth. And the truth has numbers in it. She looked back down at him. Something in her face had shifted slightly. Not to peace exactly, but to the particular steadiness of someone who has made a decision and is standing in it. Ethan, she said. Yeah. When this is over, she stopped. When it's over, he said, we're going home. She looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded, and the word home sat between them like something solid, like ground you could stand on. Bennett arrived the next morning on the stage from Denver. Ethan saw him from across the main street and understood immediately and completely why the man had been able to do what he'd done in Boston for as long as he'd done it. He was perhaps 50, well-dressed in a way that was understated enough to seem like it wasn't trying, with the kind of face that suggested reasonable intelligence and comfortable authority. He moved through the street the way powerful men move, not rushing, not showing effort, radiating the assumption that the world would arrange itself around him given sufficient time. He looked around the main street of Harwick with the specific expression of someone making calculations. Then his eyes found Ethan. There was a moment of mutual assessment that lasted perhaps 5 seconds. The two of them on opposite sides of a muddy street in a mountain town in February, and nothing was said and nothing needed to be said because the situation was sufficiently clear on its own terms. Bennett looked away first. He went into the hotel. Ethan stayed where he was a moment longer, in the cold, in the mud, in the mountain town that was his territory, and not Bennett's, and let himself feel the anger that he'd been keeping at a managed distance for the past weeks. He let himself feel it fully, cataloged it, and then packed it back down into the place where it would be most useful. Not in his hands, not in his mouth, but somewhere quiet and load-bearing, somewhere it could do structural work. Then he went to send another telegram to Boston, because Eleanor needed to understand that the timeline had moved, and that whatever she was doing, she needed to do it faster. The next 4 days were the longest of his life, which was saying something given that he'd had 15 years of long days to compare them to. Bennett met with Pruitt. Bennett's lawyer met with the territorial circuit judge who happened to be in Harwick for the month, a fact Bennett had clearly known before he arrived, which meant his information network extended further into this territory than Ethan had hoped. Witnesses were deposed. Documents were filed. The machinery of legal pressure turned with the greased efficiency of money applied in the right places, and on the third night, someone threw kerosene through the hotel window. Ethan was in the chair outside Pruitt's back room when the fire bell started. Not sleeping, just sitting in the dark in the particular half-present state of a man whose body is resting and whose mind is not. He was moving before he'd consciously registered what the sound meant, out the door and into the street where the orange light was already visible 2 buildings down. The hotel was on fire. The ground floor was not yet fully involved, but the east wing, where the overflow guests were put, where Violet had been moved when Pruitt decided the storeroom wasn't appropriate for a week-long stay, was lit from inside with the specific quality of light that meant accelerant. He went through the front door without stopping. The smoke hit him in the lobby. Not the worst yet, but thick enough that his eyes started watering immediately, and the air had a chemical edge underneath the wood smoke that confirmed what he already knew. Kerosene. The stairs to the east wing were clear, but the hallway at the top was not, and he went through it with his arm across his face and his boots finding the floor by feel when the smoke dropped below knee level. Her door was the third on the left. He hit it with his shoulder without knocking, which was not a courtesy situation, and the door gave on the second impact, and he went in low because the smoke was thinner near the floor, and she was already awake. Of course she was already awake. She'd heard the fire bell the same as everyone, and she was at the window trying to assess the drop to the alley below. "Don't," he said. "It's too far. Come here." "The hall. I just came through it. We have a minute. Come here." She came. She took his hand and he pulled her arm across his shoulder, and they went back through the hallway that was worse than it had been 30 seconds ago, the fire having found the wall between the east wing and the main structure and beginning to say something serious about it, and down the stairs and through the lobby and out the front door into the cold night air, where half of Harwick was standing in the street watching the hotel burn. They stood on the frozen mud of the main street, both of them breathing hard, her hand still in his, and the fire lit up the faces of the crowd, and the snow on the rooftops and the mountains above everything. And Ethan looked back at the building and thought very clearly and very specifically about what he was going to do when he found out who had thrown the kerosene. Violet was coughing. He looked at her. Her face was streaked with smoke, and her hair was singed at the edges, and she was in her nightgown with his coat thrown over her shoulders because he'd put it there somewhere in the chaos without registering doing it. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No." She coughed again. "Are you?" "No." She looked at the hotel. Something in her face had gone past the controlled surface entirely. She wasn't managing her expression right now, and what was underneath was not fear. It was fury, cold, specific, personal fury. "He did this," she said. "I know. He tried to kill me." "I know." She turned and looked at him, and the fury was still there, but underneath it something had cracked open. The place in her that had been trying to stay steady for so long had finally, briefly, stopped trying, and what was underneath was just a person who was tired and frightened and furious and still standing. He pulled her against him in the middle of the street, in front of the entire town of Harwick. And she let him, and she stood there with her face against his shoulder for exactly 30 seconds before she straightened up and took a breath and looked around the crowd with her jaw set. "I need to speak to Pruitt," she said. "Tomorrow," he said. "Now." She looked at him. "He tried to kill me, Ethan, in front of this whole town. This changes what Pruitt can do." She was right. He knew she was right. The attempted murder of a woman in custody in a hotel while the town watched the building burn, that was not something a judge could ignore regardless of who had arranged the paperwork. The crowd was still watching them. Men from the saloon, women in their coats, the hardware store owner who'd been the first to come out with a bucket, Colfax standing to the left, whose face had the expression of a man who has been a minor instrument of something he now deeply regrets. And across the street, in the doorway of the general store, Raymond Bennett. He was watching the fire. His expression was carefully arranged into the appropriate civic concern, but his eyes moved to Violet and something passed across his face. Something quick and controlled, gone almost before it registered. Violet saw it. Ethan felt her go still beside him in a way that was different from her usual stillness. This was the stillness of someone who has just seen a confirmation of something they already knew. "He's going to try to run," she said quietly. "If Eleanor doesn't come tomorrow, he's going to decide this has gone wrong enough, and he's going to run." Ethan looked across the street. Bennett was already turning away from the fire, moving toward the hotel. No, past it, toward the stable at the end of the block. "Pruitt," Ethan said, loud enough to carry. Pruitt was 6 feet to his left. He'd seen it too. "Mr. Bennett," Pruitt said, and his voice carried the full weight of 60 years and 2 territories and a badge he'd earned rather than bought. "I'd like you to stay where I can see you tonight." Bennett stopped. He turned around. He looked at the sheriff. He looked at Ethan. He looked at Violet, standing in the firelight in a borrowed coat with smoke in her hair and her chin level and her eyes absolutely clear. He smiled. The smile of a man who has not yet accepted that he is losing. "Of course, Sheriff," he said. "Happy to oblige." But his lawyer, Ethan noticed, had already slipped around the corner of the stable and was presumably heading somewhere with a horse. It didn't matter. Let the lawyer run. Lawyers were replaceable. The ledgers were not. Eleanor had to come. The morning had to hold. The truth had to be the kind that survived the night. Ethan stood in the frozen street of Harwick, with the hotel burning behind him, and the mountains dark above everything, and Violet's hand finding his in the dark, and he held on, and he waited for morning. Eleanor arrived on the morning stage. Ethan had been awake since before 4, sitting outside Pruitt's office in the cold with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, watching the street. The hotel was a ruin, the east wing gone completely, the main structure standing but gutted, the smell of wet ash hanging over the whole block in the still morning air. Harwick had turned out to help with the bucket line the night before, which was what small towns did, and the effort had saved the adjacent buildings even if it hadn't saved the hotel itself. Nobody had slept much. Pruitt had kept Bennett in the saloon under what he diplomatically called protective custody and what was, by any honest measure, house arrest without the paperwork. Bennett had accepted this with the careful compliance of a man conserving his energy for the next move. His 2 imported witnesses had taken rooms at the boarding house. Delacroix had disappeared sometime around midnight, which Pruitt noted in his log with the neutral precision of a man who suspects he knows where this particular thread leads. The stage came in at 7:15. Ethan was at the depot before it stopped. Sister Eleanor was not what he'd pictured. He'd constructed, from Violet's description, an image of someone soft-spoken and gentle, the kind of person who ran an orphanage in the way of quiet religious devotion. What stepped off the stage was a woman of perhaps 60 with iron-gray hair and a face that had the particular set of someone who had spent decades dealing with difficult realities and had long since stopped being surprised by them. She was carrying a leather satchel that she held close to her body with both hands, and she looked around Harwick's main street with sharp, assessing eyes. Those eyes found Ethan. "You're the rancher," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Where is she?" He took her to Violet, who was at Walter's boarding room. Walter had arrived the previous evening when the fire bell reached his valley, because of course he had, and had immediately produced blankets and hot food and the kind of steady practical presence that was his best quality. The reunion between Violet and Eleanor was not sentimental in its surface details, No weeping, no excessive exclamation, but Ethan watched the way Violet's shoulders dropped when she saw her, the involuntary physical release of someone who has been holding themselves together alone for a very long time and has just been handed permission to stop. "You got everything," Violet said. Eleanor set the satchel on the table. "Everything I had. 3 ledgers, the correspondence, the separate account records you copied." She paused. "I also have something you didn't give me." Violet looked at her. 2 weeks after you left, a young man came to the orphanage. He'd worked in Bennett's office in the record room. He said he'd heard what happened to you, and he had his own copies of certain documents, different documents, covering a period you didn't have access to. Eleanor looked at the satchel. "He was afraid. He didn't know what to do with them. I told him to leave them with me." Violet sat down slowly. "Eleanor," she said, "how much is in there?" "Enough," Eleanor said, "that when I showed a summary to a law clerk in Boston before I left, he told me Raymond Bennett would be lucky to avoid a federal charge." The room was quiet for a moment. Walter, from his chair in the corner, said, "Well, that changes things somewhat." It changed things considerably. Pruitt arranged the hearing for 2 o'clock that afternoon in the town hall, which was the largest interior space in Harwick and the closest thing the territory had to a formal courtroom outside of Denver. Judge Harlan Cross, who had been scheduled to ride on to his next stop that morning and was not pleased about the delay, was nevertheless persuaded to remain when Pruitt presented him with a summary of what Sister Eleanor had brought from Boston. Cross was a territorial judge of the old type. Not brilliant, not especially warm, but genuinely committed to the proposition that law was supposed to mean something, and what he read in that summary apparently spoke to that commitment in a direct and personal way. The whole town came. This was inevitable, and Ethan had expected it. Harwick was 300 people, and the past 24 hours had given them a burning hotel, an attempted murder, and the dramatic arrival of a nun from Boston carrying a leather satchel, and no reasonable accounting of human nature could have kept them away. They filled every chair in the town hall and stood along the walls 3 deep, and the noise of them subsided only when Pruitt came in, followed by Judge Cross, and then Bennett and his remaining witness, and then Violet and Eleanor. Violet walked in with her head level and her hands quiet at her sides, and she sat down at the respondent's table across from Bennett, and she did not look at him. Not once. Not in the way of someone trying to avoid something. In the way of someone who has decided that he does not merit the attention. Ethan sat in the front row of the gallery with Walter beside him. He watched Bennett's face when Eleanor came in with the satchel. Watched the precise moment when Bennett's composure shifted. Not broke, not yet, but developed a quality of tightness around the jaw that was not there before. Bennett knew what was in that satchel. He didn't know how much of it or how damning the arrangement of it would be in front of a judge. But he knew the general shape of the problem, and the general shape was bad enough to change the geography of his face. Judge Cross ran a direct proceeding. He had neither the patience nor the inclination for theatrical legal maneuvering, and he said so at the outset. Looking at Bennett's lawyer, a replacement had been located overnight, a local man named Garrett, who had taken the job with the expression of someone who suspected he was going to regret it, with the particular steadiness of a man who has been doing this long enough to have seen every variety of courtroom theater and has strong feelings about all of them. The charges were read. The warrant was presented. Bennett's lawyer rose and delivered his opening argument with the polished confidence of someone working from a prepared script, emphasizing the documented evidence of theft, the credible witnesses, the clear legal standing of his client. It was, technically, a competent argument. It assumed that the response would be denial, and that denial without evidence was just noise. Then Eleanor opened the satchel. She was not a lawyer. She didn't present the documents with legal formality. She simply placed them on the table in front of Judge Cross and explained, in the plain, methodical language of a woman who had spent 60 years dealing with facts, exactly what each one represented. The ledger for calendar year 1882. The corresponding entries that showed funds transferred from investor accounts into a private instrument. The 1883 ledger with the same pattern expanded. The correspondence between Bennett and a financial agent in New York that used language sufficiently oblique to suggest the writer was aware the content would not bear direct examination. The records from the young man in the record room covering 1884 which showed the scale of the diversion had grown to the point where several of the original investors were receiving falsified statements that bore no relationship to the actual state of their accounts. The room was very quiet while Eleanor spoke. Bennett's lawyer objected twice. Cross overruled him both times with a brevity that suggested he was increasingly uninterested in the objections. Bennett himself sat at his table with the face of a man who is watching something he built with great care collapse from the foundation upward, and who is trying to calculate in real time whether there is any remaining angle that saves any part of the structure. Ethan watched that calculation happen behind Bennett's eyes and watched it produce nothing, which gave him a satisfaction he wasn't entirely comfortable with, but was not going to pretend he didn't feel. Then it was Violet's turn. She spoke for 23 minutes. Ethan counted because counting was still the thing he did when his hands couldn't be busy. She described the office on Commonwealth Avenue. The evening Bennett came to her desk after the others had left. The nature of what he'd proposed and the clarity with which she'd refused it. The missing petty cash. The manner in which her professional reputation had been systematically destroyed in the weeks that followed. She said all of it in the same direct, unornamented way she said everything. No performance, no appeal for sympathy, just the arrangement of events in their actual sequence. It was, Ethan thought, the most powerful thing about her testimony. She wasn't asking anyone to feel sorry for her. She was simply requiring them to look at what had happened and call it what it was. Bennett's lawyer cross-examined her for 15 minutes. She did not become confused or upset or inconsistent. She answered every question with the particular precision of someone who is telling the truth and therefore doesn't need to manage it. At one point, the lawyer suggested that her departure from Boston under an assumed name, she had used a different surname when answering the advertisement, a practical precaution she acknowledged freely, indicated consciousness of guilt. Violet looked at him with the gray-green eyes that had been measuring people for accuracy since long before any of this had started. "I used a different name," she said, "because the man who had falsely accused me of theft had made it impossible for me to use my own. If that indicates consciousness of guilt, it also indicates what it actually was. A woman trying to survive a situation that the man who created it is sitting in this room right now." The gallery made a sound. Cross didn't gavel it down. He just waited for it to settle. Bennett's two witnesses testified. One of them, under cross-questioning from Pruitt, who had taken it upon himself to act in the interest of the court in the absence of a prosecutor, contradicted the other on 3 specific details. The contradiction was not large, but it was the kind of contradiction that happens when people have agreed on a story rather than experienced an event, and Cross noted it in writing. Bennett testified last. He was, as Violet had said, very good at saying things. He was calm and credible and expressed himself with the measured concern of a man who has been wronged and is being extraordinarily reasonable about it. He acknowledged that the ledgers existed. He disputed their interpretation. He suggested, with delicate implication, that the documents had been selectively copied and that the full picture would show legitimate business practices that the partial record obscured. Cross let him finish. Then Cross looked at the ledgers. Then he looked at Bennett. "Mr. Bennett," he said, in the tone of a man who has stopped being neutral and has not yet decided how angry to be, "I've been on the territorial bench for 11 years. In that time, I have seen a number of creative arrangements of financial records. What I have in front of me does not appear to be a selective copy. It appears to be a systematic pattern covering 3 years that would require an extraordinary sequence of coincidences to be accounted for by your proposed interpretation." He paused. "I'm going to be requesting that a full federal audit of your business accounts be conducted before any further proceedings. In the meantime," he looked at Pruitt, "the charges against Miss Hale are dismissed for want of credible evidence. The warrant is void." He looked back at Bennett. "Mr. Bennett, I am detaining you pending communication with the Federal District Court in Denver regarding the matter of investor fraud. You will remain in Sheriff Pruitt's custody until I receive instruction." Bennett's lawyer said something. Cross looked at him, and he stopped. The room erupted. Not violently. It was Harwick, not a mob, but with the specific noise of 300 people who have been watching something for 3 hours and have finally reached a conclusion they had opinions about. Ethan sat in the front row and let the noise wash over him and looked at Violet, who was still at the respondents' table, very still, with Eleanor's hand on her arm. She was looking at the table, then she looked up, and she found him in the crowd the way you find a fixed point when everything else is moving, and something passed between them that didn't need description or translation. Pruitt was already moving toward Bennett. Bennett stood and accepted the restraint with the careful dignity of a man who has not yet fully processed that the ground has gone out from under him, which sometimes takes a moment. The moment Bennett's hands were secured behind his back, the last of whatever had been holding Harwick in suspension released, and the room became fully, irreversibly loud. Walter appeared at Ethan's elbow. "Well," he said. "Don't say anything," Ethan said. "I wasn't going to say anything." "You were going to say I told you so." "I was going to say," Walter said with careful dignity, "that the post stock is still available for the east fence whenever the ground softens, which is what I've been saying all along." Ethan looked at him. Walter was trying very hard not to look self-satisfied and failing completely. "The east fence," Ethan said. "Right. In the spring," Walter said. "I'll bring it down in the spring." Violet came through the crowd to them, Eleanor at her side, and she stopped in front of Ethan and looked at him with an expression he didn't have a name for: relief and exhaustion, and something underneath both of those that was warmer and more permanent. She looked like someone who has put down something very heavy and is still feeling the ghost weight of it in her arms. "It's done," she said. "Not completely," he said. "The federal case will take time." "I know, but—" She stopped. "It's done enough." Eleanor looked between the two of them with the sharp, perceptive gaze of a woman who had run an orphanage for 30 years and had developed strong instincts about the state of human relationships. She said nothing, which was itself a kind of eloquence. They left Harwick the next morning. The road back up to the ranch was brutal. It always was in February. Ice under the packed snow, the horses having to work for every uphill yard. But the sky was clear and the mountains were enormous in their ordinary way, indifferent and absolute, and somehow, on this particular morning, not oppressive. Just present. Just the world being the world. Violet sat beside him on the wagon seat, which was not where she'd sat on the first ride up this road 4 months ago. On that ride, she'd been inside the coach, folded into a corner, braced against a drop-off, arriving at a place she hadn't planned for. This was different. She was upright and looking at the mountains, and her shoulder was against his arm in the cold, and neither of them said much on the way up, which was fine because neither of them needed to. When the ranch came into view, the barn, the fence line, the cabin with its chimney that was going to need repointing before next winter, she let out a breath that he felt more than heard. "There it is," she said. "There it is," he agreed. They put the horses up and went inside and built the fire back up from coals, and she made coffee because that was what she did, and he checked the stock because that was what he did. And by noon, the ranch was running on its ordinary rhythms the way it had been running for weeks, except that the particular quality of ordinary had shifted into something neither of them was going to jinx by naming it too precisely. They married in April. It was not a grand event, partly because neither of them wanted a grand event, and partly because grand events required planning energy they were still rebuilding. Walter and Helen drove up and stood in the yard on a morning when the snow was finally pulling back from the south pasture and the first mud of spring was showing through. A circuit preacher who happened to be passing through Harwick was persuaded to make the detour. Eleanor had stayed the winter, ostensibly to oversee the documentation process for the federal case, practically because she had taken a look at the situation and decided she wasn't needed in Boston as much as she was needed here. And she stood with Violet and straightened her collar with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had marshaled orphans through worse occasions than this. The ceremony was short. Ethan stumbled over one of the vows, which was so entirely characteristic that Violet pressed her lips together to keep from smiling, and then stopped pressing and just smiled. Afterward, Helen cried, which embarrassed her and amused Walter. Eleanor produced a cake from somewhere that was significantly better constructed than Violet's first apple cake had been, which Violet noted and filed away as a technical challenge. Walter brought the fence posts he'd promised in February and spent the afternoon with Ethan doing the east fence, while the women sat on the porch in the spring air talking about things the men would never fully know. The federal case against Raymond Bennett concluded in June. The audit had found, in the end, that the full scope of the fraud exceeded what even Eleanor's documents had shown, closer to $40,000 over 4 years, pulled from the accounts of 11 investors who had trusted him with their money and received falsified statements in return. Three of those investors had engaged lawyers of their own the moment the audit became public, which was the particular kind of consequence that Bennett's careful social construction had never accounted for. The anger of wealthy men who had been made to look foolish. He was convicted on 7 counts. He went to a federal penitentiary in the fall. His wife, Ethan read in the Denver paper that covered the sentencing, had filed for divorce in July, which the paper reported with the neutral brevity of a legal notice, and which contained more story than most novels. Violet read the article twice, set it down on the table, picked up her coffee. "Well," she said. "Yeah," Ethan said. She looked out the window at the summer pasture, the cattle moving slow in the heat, the mountains green at the lower elevations for the first time since he'd arrived here 15 years ago, and she'd never seen them at all. "I don't feel what I thought I'd feel," she said. "What did you think you'd feel?" "Triumphant, something I spent so long being afraid of him." She turned her cup in her hands. "Now he's just gone. And the mountains are still there, and the cattle need water, and the east fence is holding." "The east fence is holding," he confirmed. She looked at him. "Is that what life is? Things end and other things are just still there?" He thought about it honestly. "I think so," he said. "The things that matter don't make noise when they stay, only when they go." She considered this. That's either wise or depressing. Both, probably. She made a sound that was definitely a laugh this time. Not small and involuntary. A real one. The kind that used the whole face. The kind that had been rare in this cabin for 15 years and was not rare anymore. The sewing business started in the fall. This was Violet's idea, and she'd been building toward it for months, taking in mending for the ranching families in the valley, repairing garments that would otherwise have required a 40-mile round trip to Harwick, doing alterations, and eventually some construction from patterns she'd ordered from a catalog. By October, she had more work than she had hours, which was a problem Ethan helped her solve by building a second work table in the corner of the main room that now, he noticed, had curtains on the window and 3 photographs on the wall. The photographs were his. He'd taken them out of the box under the bed sometime in May, the exact day he couldn't remember. He hadn't made a ceremony of it. He just put them on the wall because it seemed like they should be there. Because Margaret was part of the history of this place, and this place was his, and there was no reason to keep the history in a box anymore. Violet had said nothing when she saw them. She'd looked at them for a long moment, at the wedding portrait, at the other 2. And then she'd gone back to what she was doing. But that evening she'd asked him, with the particular careful directness she used for things that mattered, to tell her about the woman in the photographs. So he had. He'd told her about Margaret for the better part of 2 evenings. Not the grief, though that was there too, but the actual woman. The way she'd reorganized the kitchen the second week she arrived, which he had apparently not noticed, was funny until Violet pointed it out. The way she'd named every one of the cattle, which he'd pretended to find ridiculous and secretly found endearing. The curtains, which she'd sewn herself from fabric she'd brought from her mother's house. The wildflowers in the ceramic jar on the windowsill. After the second evening, Violet had found dried flowers, the last of the summer, gone brown but still holding their shape, and put them in an old jar on the windowsill. He'd looked at the jar for a long time without saying anything. "Is that all right?" she'd said from across the room. "Yeah," he'd said. "That's all right." The news that she was pregnant came on a Tuesday morning in November, almost exactly a year from the day she'd stepped off a coach in a frozen mountain road and fallen into his arms and said words that had cracked his life open in ways neither of them had the language for yet. She told him at the breakfast table, directly, in the plain way she told him everything. She said it, and then she sat there with her hands around her coffee cup and looked at him, measuring his face with the precision she'd been measuring it with since November of last year. He sat very still for a moment. He wasn't sure what he was feeling except that it was large and complicated, and had the particular quality of things that have been impossible for a long time suddenly becoming possible, which is not always a comfortable feeling, even when it's a good one. He thought about the winter Margaret had miscarried, and they'd both been silent for 3 weeks after. He thought about the years after that, when the question had simply stopped being one. He thought about the box under the bed, and the photographs on the wall, and the flower next to the dry goods shelf, and the east fence holding. He thought about spring. "Okay, he said. Violet looked at him. "Okay? I mean," he stopped. Tried again. I mean, I'm... He shook his head. I don't have the words right now. That's all right. She was watching him with something in her face that was not the measuring look. It was softer than that, more private. Take your time. He reached across the table and covered her hands with his, both of them, her hands and the coffee cup between them still warm. I thought this was over, he said. Not the life on the ranch. That had never felt over, not even in the worst of the 15 years. He meant the part of life that was for other people. The future tense part, the one that required you to believe tomorrow was a real place you were actually going to arrive at. I thought that part was just done. I know, she said. It's not. No, she said. It's not. They sat there with the morning coming in through the curtained window and the mountains outside doing what mountains did, which was nothing dramatic, which was simply being there the way they had always been there, long before Ethan Crow and long before Violet Hale and long before any of the things that had happened in the valley below them, and long after, too. The cabin was warm. The coffee was good. There was flour next to the dry goods shelf and photographs on the wall and a jar of dried flowers on the windowsill. And outside the east fence was holding, and somewhere down in the valley, Walter Boone was probably doing something inadvisable with the best intentions, and would need to be talked to about it eventually. And the cattle would need water in the morning the way they always needed water, and the chimney still needed repointing before winter, and none of these things were small and none of them were large. They were just the texture of a life that was actually being lived. Ethan Crow had spent 15 years mistaking stillness for safety and silence for peace. He'd built walls out of routine and called it survival and believed his own accounting of it for so long that he'd forgotten there was another kind of counting available to him, the kind that added things up instead of holding them steady, that moved towards something instead of simply enduring. He'd needed a forged letter and a woman who had nowhere else to go and one terrible road in November to remember that. He would never say it was worth it. The lie that brought her here, the danger that followed, the nights he'd lain awake counting toward morning. None of that was worth it in the sense of being justified by its outcomes. Life didn't work that way, and anyone who told you it did was selling something. But it had happened. And he was here. And she was across the table from him with both hands warm under his, and a future inside her that neither of them had earned or planned or deserved in any particular. Just arrived at, the way you arrive at most things worth having, which is to say sideways, in the cold, with more uncertainty than you'd have chosen and less time than you thought you needed. The mountain didn't care about any of it. That was the thing about the mountain. It had been there before all of them and would be there long after, and it held no judgment about the things that happened in its shadow. It just stood there, enormous and patient and indifferent, letting the seasons do their work. But in the cabin where silence had once been the loudest thing, laughter was louder now. And that, in the end, was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.